I think that this might be a really important clue as to how the most senior Republican in the House views all this as a joke. He's joking now about violence toward Speaker Pelosi.
And it's not funny. Nicole, it's very good to be with you. And I was thinking about it and listening to that audio and thinking, does Mr. McCarthy think he's some 1960s vulgar comedian? He's not. He's not funny. He's the alleged leader of the Republican Party in the House. And so what he has said and what he has done in his votes, in his floor debate, in that was actually called a statesman's dinner. He was certainly not statesmanlike. He was indecent. He was vulgar. He was threatening violence against the Speaker of the House. He shows utterly no respect. And it's unacceptable to me. I've been witness to it on the floor. I've been subject of it on the floor. This man, I think he's gotten ahead of himself. The one thing I do want to say is he began that audio clip by saying he looks forward to winning the majority. I predict he will not win the majority, and I believe he is such a failed leader, tethered to an even bigger failed leader, that he will not hold on to his minority leadership.
Well, and the Republicans used to, I don't know how to put it, pretend to try to, if not appeal to women, not totally offend them. And his jihad against Liz Cheney to purge her from leadership, his embrace of Marjorie Taylor Greene's freedom to be whoever she wants to be in his ranks. And now this sort of, in his words, joke, I don't accept that it was a joke, this loose talk about violence toward the Speaker. What is it like up there among this largely male Republican caucus and the rest of their colleagues?
Well, it isn't funny. It is really revealing of who Mr. McCarthy is. He's weak, and he's appealing to a shrinking base, as you heard in that awkward set of laughter following his statement. But what I've seen on the floor, you've seen it in floor debate, and I've seen it up close. He approached me with that same sort of bullying attitude when I asked him about his former support for a bill of mine. He physically leaned over me. I had to physically put my hand up and say, you're not being appropriate, back up. And so it just doesn't surprise me. But also what people can see very publicly is this is the same man as the leader of his party in March of this year voted against the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. That's who he is. That is his failed leadership. He lifts up the weakest. He lifts up the most vulgar and not substantive of members of his party. And he shuns those who lead. This is a man, of course, who stood up after the insurrection and said that the president was responsible. This was days after it. An insurrection where people came in incited by the president to assassinate those next in the line of succession, his own vice president, Speaker Pelosi, and any other member of Congress that they could have gotten their hands on. He stood up and said the president is responsible, and then, of course, has cowered away from that ever since. We will see, as a result of these investigations, his complicitness in these acts of January the 6th.
So Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger are on board with subpoenas for any and all material witnesses. In separate interviews, they have both described, or at least one of them has described, Kevin McCarthy and now Jim Jordan as material witnesses. Do you believe that we will see the day when they testify before the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection?
I was interested in the conversation you just had about whether Jim Jordan fights the subpoena or comes before the committee. I'm going to predict he does both because he loves a negative spotlight. So he'll both fight the subpoena and then revel in coming before the committee with nonsense. These are shrinking members of their party. They're shrinking and shriveling in the face of what will be revealed by the facts. It was very telling when Mr. Jordan suddenly couldn't remember whether he had talked to the president before, during, after the insurrection. It was a really memorable day. You'd remember if you spoke to the president that day.
What do you think their end game is? I mean, the Select Committee now is going on without Kevin McCarthy's participation. The crisis is now clear. A third law enforcement official who responded to the deadly insurrection has died by suicide today. There is a current warning from the Department of Homeland Security about an ongoing threat of domestic violent extremism. The former chief of staff's on TV saying, stuff that would be crazy if it didn't also undergird a threat about the ex-president huddling with his cabinet. There is no cabinet for an ex-president. He doesn't even have Twitter. I mean, what in your view, or what do you hypothesize sort of the end point is?
I think their end game for those actors whom we're talking about right now is desperation. They are desperately trying to figure out how they get out of this as unscathed as they possibly can. They see their power is shrinking. They see their base is shrinking as more and more of the truth is revealed. A president obviously willing to call his own Department of Justice and say, just call it corrupt. I'll take it from there. So these folks we're talking about, a would-be leader, he's a failed leader, Mr. McCarthy, Mr. Jordan and some of the others are desperately trying to figure out how do they avoid culpability and how do they try to remain in power. In the meantime, the committee is so credibly meeting and getting to work based on the truth, not distracted by the nonsense and the clown car that would have been Mr. Banks and Mr. Jordan participating in this. They're going to move forward. They're going to get to the facts. I had the chance to be with the 4 officers who testified before the committee Tuesday of last week. I had the chance to meet them at dinner, along with the commander, their commander for the D.C. police. So my extraordinary, heartbreaking sympathy for the D.C. police in the loss of their colleague, the officer who was among those who responded and saved our lives. That's what I cannot understand among the leaders on the Republican side. Their lives were saved by these police officers. How dare they disrespect them? How dare they try to defund them? And how dare they try to distract from getting at the truth?